Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you've been a regular reader of Who, What, Why, you know that our focus on election integrity has been relentless. You have followed the stories about voter suppression in Florida, Georgia, North Dakota, and North Carolina. But important as all this is, it's only part of, maybe only half of the story. It was Joseph Stalin who said that it's not the people who vote that count, it's the people who count the votes. We saw in the 2000 presidential election the degree to which that really matters. But even then, with a presidency decided by 5 justices of the Supreme Court, did we really get the full story? Do we really know to this day what happened in Broward County or Miami-Dade? What did we learn? And more specifically, what did the people who counted the votes learn that may have impacted us in 2016 and may still be impacting us in just a few days? To give us insight into this part of the story, Who, What, Why has just published its first ebook entitled Stolen Future, The Untold Story of the 2000 Election. Its author is our guest today, Stephen Singular. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Tell us how you first came to get yourself curious about this story.
Well, I had followed, of course, the aftermath of the election and the Supreme Court decision, and didn't really think too much about it up until that point. But then I knew somebody as a friend in Florida who had voted in Broward County and who had voted with an absentee ballot with the punch cards, and this individual happened to be a mechanical engineer, and we'd known each other for a long time, and he called me and started telling me about his experience as a voter, which was basically that he'd punched out his cards he and his wife had, and they noticed that the chads, the little perforations that you punch out to signify your candidate, had basically gone back in their holes. And he didn't quite understand why that would happen. I mean, we know about the hanging chads and how they sort of hung off the back of the piece of paper. We've all seen that. But these actually went back into the holes. So what that meant was if he hadn't done anything else and had just mailed in his absentee ballot, it would have looked as if he'd voted for no one. But he was a curious fellow and an engineer and very, very bright, and he looked at it and said, well, that doesn't really make sense. So he punched it out again, and so did his wife, and they actually tore the perforations off of the cards and mailed them in, went on vacation, came back on November 7th or, thereabouts, the election night of 2000, and watched this chaos unfold on television where the networks came out, as many will remember, and said that Al Gore was the 43rd president of the United States, I think it was, and that was what had happened, and that was based upon the polling that television networks had relied on for a long time. People vote, they come out, they ask them who they voted for, they do statistical extrapolations. It's a very scientific thing, and in the past it had worked. Suddenly something went wrong, and the networks with great chagrin came back on and said, well, we take back our projection. The vote total seemed to be changing for some reason, and we don't really know who won. And many of the problems were being generated in that Miami-Dade, Broward County, South Florida area, all over the state in some instances, but heavily down there. So my friend was watching this with his wife, and the lights sort of went on, and he thought, well, I wonder if other people, either through absentee ballots or through voting at the polls on that night, that day, had a similar experience, because what was coming in was what are called a number of undervotes, which means that it looks as if you didn't vote for anybody because nothing is punched out, or overvotes where multiple chads have been punched out and it looks as if you voted for 3 or 4 people, or how many. So as many listening here will remember, I mean, it set off absolute chaos in terms of the presidential election. The networks were flip-flopping. We got kicked into the courts. very complicated situation because George W. Bush is running for president. His brother Jeb Bush is the governor of Florida. Bush's confidant, let's say, is Secretary of State Katherine Harris, who controls what the time frame for when votes will be counted and certified. So they clearly were interested in shutting this down as quickly as possible and saying that George Bush won by about 541 votes, 541 votes in Florida, which is obviously tiny margin in the state with 6 million voters. And Gore had won the popular election as well. So all of this was sort of brewing for about 6 weeks, and then I started talking to my friend, and he said, everybody's talking about the machines that were used, the Votomatic machines, where the punch cards go through, and people are talking about the incompetence of voters, and they're too stupid to figure out how to punch through a card, and all of those things, but nobody's talking about the cards themselves and how they actually performed. And he said, maybe you should come down here and look into this. By that time, the legal situations were resolved. On December 12th, Bush was effectively appointed the President of the United States, as you said, by a 5-4 vote. And that dust had kind of cleared, but a couple of things were happening. A number of groups like the NAACP were suing various organizations in Florida over what had happened because a number of the discarded ballots had occurred in heavily African-American precincts. The Votomatic machines were being looked into, and there were people rushing forward in the election systems business and saying, well, those punch cards don't work anymore. Let's rush in and sell all these disgruntled folks electronic voting machines. Florida itself bought about $70 million of the dollars worth of that technology in order to get around this problem the next time.
While all of this was going on, what did you decide to do next?
I decided to go to Florida. And my friend lived in Fort Lauderdale, which was very close to like the elections warehouse, where much of the equipment from the recent voting was kept. Not only the equipment, but the cards that had been used, and beyond that, the cards that hadn't been used. So there were what we called virgin voter punch cards on the premises there, and on sort of almost a lark, we decided to go in and see if we could get some of those unused cards and just start to examine them. And the interesting part of that, when I think back on it, is that we did go in, talk to the supervisor of elections, and he gladly and openly gave us a couple of batches of cards. And when I look back on it, I think, they didn't know what happened either. That was the thrust of everything these election officials said. It's like, we're getting blamed for this, but we didn't do anything differently from any other election. And now we're in the crosshairs of lawsuits, bad jokes by comedians, just being trashed right and left. And we don't know what happened. And I think there was a little bit of curiosity on their part to say, well, if somebody wants to look into this, well and good, because we don't have a clue. So that's where the story really started, was going there, getting some cards, and then proceeding from there.
Was there a thought in your own mind that what happened may have been as much incompetence as anything mischievous?
Well, yeah, it's a very complicated story, and there are multiple explanations. And one of the things I say is that, it's not that we do know what happened. It's that we still basically don't know. And that's sort of the crux of this story, that there were opportunities to learn more, and they weren't really developed. So when you look into the punch card arena, the way they're manufactured is that that paper is fed through an assembly line basically, and they're hit with a stamping wheel, which makes the perforations on the cards. In Broward County, it was 228 of those little perforations. In Miami-Dade, it was 312. But those things are calculated down, as I would learn, to about 1/5,000th of an inch. So you're dealing in microscopic differences in how those machines function, and they become dull through usage, as any machine does. So there's always a margin for just incompetence or human error or machine error in that card making process. It was rather startling for me to learn that our election system sort of hangs on that 1/5,000th of an inch. I'd never even imagined anything like that before getting involved in this. You sort of think it would be a little more protected than that, but that was coming straight from the election officials. So we got the cards. My friend began to sort of test them on his own. We were looking for a piece of equipment called a strain gauge, which is what measures downward pressure as it's measured in grams. And there's this industry standard for cards that is basically 150 grams to 350. So when you're applying that pressure downward, the Chad should come out. We had cards from two major manufacturers. One was Sequoia Pacific from California, and one was from ES&S based in Omaha, Nebraska. And the great bulk of the cards in Broward and Miami-Dade had come from ES&S. So we wanted to see if there was any, variation in the cards, variation in the Chads, variation in how they might have behaved when you were putting pressure on them. Would they fall out easily? So too many would fall out, creating an overvote. Would they be very difficult to push out? And then if you push it out, would the Chad go back in, as it apparently happened in widespread cases in the election, causing an undervote? There were approximately 200,000 of these votes, overvotes and undervotes, in the election itself. And as you will recall me saying a few minutes ago, Bush was apparently or allegedly ahead by 541 votes. So razor thin margin, obviously. What was contained in those 200,000 votes that were tossed aside? What sort of drove this was that in Miami-Dade, if you were looking at some of the African-American precincts, there were 9,000 votes that were thrown out based upon what I was just saying. They voted 10-1 for Al Gore. So, that would be 9 out of 10 would be 80, 100 votes. Bush is ahead by 541. You can do the math. So the point being, obviously, highly contested. What really happened here? And was there any possibility that cards could be produced to behave in a certain way so that you would in fact get undervotes or overvotes in certain precincts that could possibly be targeted? That became the overriding and compelling question of the investigation. And we got the cards, we ran some tests. They were preliminary, and we were not utilizing the most sophisticated equipment. There appeared to be some variation in the cards from one manufacturer to another, and there appeared to be some variation in how the Chads behaved on some of the cards. But this is highly technical stuff, and after a week or so, I decided that we had to have much more muscle involved in what we were doing. This is around the 7th day of January of 2001, which is to say it's about 13 days before the George W. Bush administration will take office. So if something happened that was that helped cause some of these problems from an intentional perspective, And if it made the entire election really illegitimate, or even if it just needed to be investigated further, all of these things were totally in play by January 7th. And so I thought, we potentially have a very large story here, and we need to get some help.
You were two guys in Florida trying to test these cards. Where did you think any help was going to come from?
I knew somebody at 60 Minutes CBS and had worked with this individual in the past and made a call. That person called Mike Wallace, the renowned anchor of CBS of 60 Minutes, and within a few hours we had kick-started a process there where they would look into this and maybe do something with it. A huge leap forward. One of their people, or a couple of their people, went to Florida, met my friend, got some of the cards, I think got some more of the cards, and began the process of testing them in a much more sophisticated way than we were capable of doing. So it looked as if by early January, like this story something could really happen here. They were putting time and resources into it. At the same time, I was running headlong into sort of a major media meat grinder there, in that I had never exactly dealt with media people at this level. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is that I was basically told, the moment I make that first phone call and sort of hand this off to 60 Minutes, I will forever be cut out of the loop of what happens after that. And it was one of those crossroads moments as a journalist where you don't quite know what to do. The clock is ticking. The issues are very complicated. You don't have the financial resources to go engage a major lab and do the kind of testing that needs to be done. So you reach out for help, and basically there was just a line drawn in the sand that says, we're in, you're out. And that becomes a part of the story going forward, because they did test the cards. I tried to communicate. I tried to learn more about what was going on, and I was totally and completely shut out. So it becomes a muddy area after that. I know that the cards were tested. I know that developments were, going on around this. And I know that went on, so that leads me to believe that they were learning things about the cards at a very intricate level that were important. While they were doing that, and they told me that I couldn't do anything, in other words, I couldn't investigate any further, I couldn't talk to anybody in the card industry, I gradually became very annoyed with that and decided to just keep working on my own. I went to Dallas, outside of Dallas, to the ES&S manufacturing plant. I sort of talked my way in there through one thing and another, and got on the factory floor to see how these cards were actually made and to try and talk to some of the people there and learn more about it. I felt it was very critical to do that in order to get any sort of grasp of the technical understanding of this. I was given a brief tour of the factory. I was asking some rather pointed questions about what had happened in Florida, where they had sold 4 million cards to Miami-Dade County and 1.5 million to Broward County prior to the 2000 election. And over a brief period of time, I became aggravating to the man who was showing me around, and he basically showed me the door. But I was able to see, and he was the man who told me point blank that, as he put it, we live in a 1/5000th inch world. In other words, a variation of 1/5000th inch on a stamping wheel that perforates those cards could basically affect how the card behaves once it's in the voting booth and the counting machine. And that was a very eerie thing for me to hear. I mean, we just had a president basically selected by the Supreme Court. based upon what appeared to be the fragility of our voting system. I think history pivoted right there in front of us, and that was the whole impetus in this. If there's more to this story, we have to get it out there, and we have to figure out what happened, not only because of what the result was in the 2000 election and what that implies for our politics going forward, but all of these companies, as I said, these voting system companies are coming in and they're selling electronic equipment to replace the punch cards. Well, we can all sort of understand how a punch card works, but there are very few of us that understand the intricacies of computerized voting. So, again, I thought this is a major issue. What if we're replacing a system where we don't even know what the problem is yet? We need to answer these questions.
So what happens next at this point?
So the story proceeded from there. I was told repeatedly, yes, CBS 60 Minutes is going to do something. We're going to get it on the air. We're going to, have something. That was all I was told. And they never knew that I went to Dallas and got on the floor of that factory. If they had, they would have been very upset. And so they never ran the story. They never communicated with me what they uncovered, but I am quite certain that they uncovered certain things. It sort of began to trail off. And then if you can put yourself back in June, July of 2001, George W. Bush's ratings were down, everything was sort of stagnant, and all of that. This story still seemed to be unfolding behind the scenes. And then, of course, we got 9/11, and everything that I was working on, or I think that others were working on, just sort of died. And nobody was going to now criticize George Bush or how he was elected or what was involved in that. And again, as I said, the world sort of pivoted in this 9-month, 10-month framework and then everything that happened after that happened.
You argue that this story has ramifications that go beyond the 2000 election, that it even goes into the 2004 election. Explain that.
The story didn't die. If one wants to delve into the 2004 election, where the key state was not Florida but Ohio, John Kerry was leading in Ohio, which was the pivotal state in the election. Whoever won it was going to win the 2004 presidential election. They now had installed not punch cards but an electronic voting system at 11:14 p.m. They head in the polls. The system crashes or goes down. It comes back up a few minutes later, and he's behind, and he loses the election. And that is one more chapter in the story. And then, of course, what really caused me to revive the story and to look into it was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I've kind of laid all this aside, and it was dormant. And I had told people back in 2001, well, what if some group gets their hands on the electronic voting system or some aspect of it and tries to manipulate the election in that manner? If you really delve into the 2004 election, that appears to be the case. It's not really what I wrote about here, and others have written about it in far greater depth and know more about it than I do.
And as you see it, what's the ramifications even in 2016?
So we get to 2016, and Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote by 3 million votes, and every poll is wrong. Every poll is dead, totally wrong, which is what happened in Florida, which echoes that, which tells me that more is going on here than meets the eye, because polls are quite accurate. And I thought, let's see if I can, revive this story and tell it, and maybe there's enough things have gone wrong around this issue, and enough is at stake where 3 of the past 5 presidential elections in the United States are at best questionable, and at worst a lot more than that. And I went to WhoWhyWhy and Russ Baker, and I found a receptive group there, and I greatly appreciate the fact that they were willing to bring this out, because I think it shows how important this issue actually is, how it's been in the recent past, how it is now, and how it will be going forward. When polls are strikingly wrong, I think you have to look into the voting aspect itself, not just saying that somebody went on, people went on Facebook and put up fake news and that kind of thing. I think it's a lot deeper than that. If you grew up like me, really believing in investigative journalism and the power of it, and this is when we really needed it the most, was in my view, in 2000. And the media has changed over the years, and there just isn't that much emphasis on that anymore. And I sort of ran into that headlong, and I think if we had gotten to the bottom of it, the whole history of the past 17 or 18 years might be different.
One of the things that you talk about is that in each of these stories, as this evolves, there really are different voting systems that are at play. There was the Votomatic system with the punch cards that we're talking about in 2000. Then the electronic voting, the kind that came after that was really part of the debate in 2004. And then it all moved to this optical scan system later in 2016. Talk about that and the broad framework of the fact that while the systems are different, a lot of the players and a lot of the companies in all of these systems are exactly the same.
Yeah, the main company that I focused on was this ES&S out of Omaha, and they were very much involved in the punch card situation in Florida in 2000, even though 2 days after the election they put up something on their website that said their systems were not really used. It was a very curious turn of phrase. Their systems may not have been used, but their cards were, and their cards were absolutely the issue. So then, again, what happened in Florida was that they rushed in. Jeb Bush's first choice as governor of Florida for the Secretary of State was not Catherine Harris, but another woman named Sandra Mortham, who was a lobbyist, a paid lobbyist, I believe, for ES&S. So it was all very entangled. Well, after the punch card fiasco, ES&S sold $70 million worth of voting equipment, electronic voting equipment, to Florida, where Bush was governor. Then you got the Democratic primary of 2002, and Janet Reno was running. I think the opponent was named McBride. I'm a little foggy on that. But then you had electronic voting, and the same things happened, just from a different angle. Votes weren't being counted. The system malfunctioned, and they didn't know who won. And there was a deadline to make a decision, and Janet Reno, in the confusion, just sort of caved in and said, "Okay, I'll let the other guy win." And so that's what happened. It didn't solve the problems, and it created more and probably more intricate problems with that kind of voting system. Then you go to 2004, as I said, and people would have to do a little digging in on their own with that, but people with very strong Republican ties were tied into the backup system that came up when the first one went down at 11:14 the night of that election. So, again, at very best, it's just totally questionable part of our history. A man named Richard Hayes Phillips wrote a book about it and went into far greater detail than I have, and shows you how the numbers shifted after the system came back up and all of that. So two elections right in a row where you don't really know who won the presidency. And I would, without going too political, I just think these are crucial things. There are major, major consequences that come out of these elections, and so you're just trying to sort of hold up a stop sign here and say, how can we fix this? When do we get to the bottom of it?
Getting back to the punch cards and what you discovered about them, in the limited amount of time you had, in the limited testing that you did with, as you said, kind of primitive equipment, did you find any difference between the cards that were produced by ES&S and cards that were made by other companies like Sequoia?
What we found was that my friend was the one running it, and he was an engineer, and he understood it better than I did. He blew the photos of the chads up 30 times, and so you could get a better idea of how much paper, this very intricate stuff, was holding on each chad. What he found was that there were some differences that he detected on the ES&S cards compared to Sequoia Pacific, which seemed to be rather consistent in how they behaved. But what he found most intriguing was that all of the chads sort of came out in a similar way, and that did not appear to him to be a random situation. In other words, they could come out, bottom to top, side to side, all of that sort of thing, and they were coming out in a consistent pattern that he called garage door, meaning that the two bottom areas swung up to the top, and he thought this was, and then they folded back in their holes, as we talked about. So he thought that that was perhaps not entirely random, and he just started raising what I thought were all of the right questions about how had this been made, and could these kinds of variations be built into the cards when they were being produced. And I go into more detail about this in the book and sort of the intricacies around all of that. He thought, and I thought, not that we had, found the Holy Grail, but we had found enough that it needed to be looked into in more depth. And I think given everything that had happened, and that there was absolutely no explanation for the malfunction of the 2000 presidential election, I mean, that's what you kind of have to remember as you go back. Again, you're blaming black people because they didn't vote properly in Miami-Dade. You're blaming elderly people in Broward County because they didn't know how to vote. You're blaming the machines. You're blaming everything. There was no reasonable explanation on the table for why any of this happened. And we thought this was a potential doorway into understanding that. And that's why we took the actions that we did. His discoveries, I think, were preliminary findings, like in any investigation, that require more investigation. And that's the point we got to. And I wish I could say I have the definitive answer here for you, but I think if we'd gone down that road, we would have learned a lot more relevant information about this.
Did you have a theory, or did your friend have a theory about how this might have been manipulated? That, in fact, if this was the case with the cards, that it would have done it for Republican punches or Democratic punches, Gore or Bush punches. How could this have been manipulated?
Well, our understanding, which was somewhat limited, was that you could potentially just program it into how. When I was on the factory floor, when you're standing there and you're watching this stamping wheel going around at incredible speeds, making the perforations in the cards, there was some understanding that could be manipulated to create variations in the cards. That's what we were looking into. I was taken into a room where they examined these cards in great detail, and I wanted to stay there with this man who was showing me around and say, show me the finest intricacies of cards as they're made through something called an optical comparator, and I want to see the variations here and all that. And he grabbed my arm and dragged me out of the room, and subsequently, very quickly, got me out of the whole building. So that was the fundamental question. Could you build variations into these things in the production process? We speculated on that, but that's what CBS, that's what 60 Minutes was investigating, and that's the information that we never got to.
The other question, I guess, is that if you could build the variations in, you could deliver certain kinds of cards to certain areas and other kinds of cards to other areas.
Well, what we learned was that, and this came from the election people in Florida, was that the voting card manufacturers know ahead of time where the cards are going, what precincts they're going to, and what the voting habits are in those precincts. So yes, it's an absolutely relevant question. They have a map, basically, of the voting before the cards are ever made. And so they have that information. The cards are coded in a particular way for each precinct so that they'll know, where those cards are being used on election night. So they have that ahead of time. And that's the first question. The next question becomes, could you then build variations in based upon that knowledge?
Talk a little bit about the security of these cards. When you first started talking about walking into where the cards were stored and then being in the factory where they're made, what kind of security existed for all of this?
Well, there was none as far as we were, concerned. I mean, I called the election supervisor in Broward County, and he said, yeah, come on in. And then, again, to my amazement, he just handed the cards over. So that was totally not secure. Talking my way into the factory in Dallas was a lot harder. And when I began to ask really, penetrating questions about the variations on the CHADs in the specific cards, and they said they had specifications for all those things. I said, well, can I see the specifications that were used for Miami-Dade County and Broward in the Florida election? No, all that's off limits. So it wasn't hard to get into the factory, but once they realized that I was there to ask some pretty piercing questions, they shut it down real fast. So, and I would assume that security is probably tighter now than it was then. But those people were on edge in the wake of that election.
You spend a lot of time in the book also talking about ES&S and a little bit about the company, people that are involved, and its history. Talk a bit about that.
They're based in Omaha. They're a privately held company. They have major ties to the Republican Party. They count about, I think at that time it was about 100 million votes a year. There have been numerous issues raised around the company for years with their electronic voting. WhoWhyWhy does an article every now and then about it. Controversy has swirled around it because it seems to be, a heavily Republican company. And so, again, these are the people making the election systems, making the cards, sort of controlling all of that. They're privately held, so it's hard to get any information out of them at all. And again, it just raises these uncomfortable questions about who's controlling our election system. And again, I mean, there seems to be a rather consistent pattern here. Gore goes down in 2000, Kerry goes down in 2004, and Hillary goes down in 2016. It's obvious who's on the winning side here. So, again, I don't offer readers all the answers, but I think we got to start asking the pertinent questions.
What is your theory and what does your gut tell you with respect to what happened regarding 60 Minutes? Did they lose interest in it? Did 9/11 cause them to lose interest in it? Or did something else potentially happen?
I think that there were a lot of issues afloat there. I think they were somewhat afraid of the story. I think the story was maybe a little too much. I mean, you got to sort of pull back and think about it. I mean, you were talking about the potentially fraudulent election of an American president after, he's been installed in office. This was an incredibly explosive story if it had blown. I think it was a hard story to prove. Based upon purely an examination of the cards, because again, you could always simply say, well, the blades got dull and they created these variations. That's always the fallback position. After a while, they said to me, what we need is somebody from the factory or somebody in the election system who will come forward and talk about this on camera. If you think about the movie The Insider, if you're familiar with it or the people listening are familiar with it, that involves tobacco. Tobacco is a big story. The fraudulent election of the President of the United States is a bigger story. We came out of this without knowing what we needed to know. No, but what we do know is that our election system has been increasingly fragile over the last 17 or 18 years. If we had gotten to the bottom of this at the appropriate time through the appropriate channels with the right people, our entire history of the last 17 or 18 years might look very different.
Did you ever get to the bottom of what really happened with 60 Minutes?
Ultimately, what 60 Minutes wanted was somebody to come on and spill the beans on everything and lay it out for a lay audience so everybody could understand it. I was told, and this was later, this was years later, it wasn't right then, that eventually they found somebody who was willing to do that. I heard this from multiple sources, but they couldn't work out the details of the legalities of talking about it. And that's a very complex thing. The person wanted to be indemnified against any sort of legal action that might come as a result of talking about this, very similar to what happened in the movie The Insider, where Russell Crowe his character didn't get that kind of protection. Maybe this person was aware of that and asked for it, couldn't get it, and nothing happened as a result of that.
Stephen Singular, the book is Stolen Future, The Untold Story of the 2000 Election. It's available in ebook from WhoWhyWhy. There are numerous links here on the page. Stephen, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.